the Mass in 50 minutes or less. So the majority of the talk tonight is going to be about this very question. The Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, called Sacrosanctum Concilium. What did it actually say? Right? But this is not a typo, this is not an error. Before we get to the bulk of the presentation, it's important that we take a step back, because the Second Vatican Council, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, didn't just drop out of the sky one day. There's a lot that prepared its way, and so if we want to understand what it said and why it said it, we need to take a few steps back. And so we'll do that just very briefly at the outset. And then finally, we'll make just a couple of suggestions about how are we supposed to interpret this. Okay? How did it go? What are the pros and cons? What should we do tomorrow about it? Okay, so let's start with number one, what's called the modern liturgical movement. Prior to the council, what was it and what did it want to do? So Pope Francis wrote a letter, I guess it's been 2 years ago now, called Desiderio Desideravi. I don't know who comes up with these titles, but that's what it's called. And he says in this letter, we owe to the council and to the liturgical movement that preceded it the rediscovery of a theological understanding of the liturgy and of its importance in the life of the church. All right, so he's calling us, and John mentioned this too, Pope Benedict has been doing this. John Paul II had done this too. This is not a new Pope Francis thing about to go back to the liturgical movement. The whole thing was about look back behind the council to what they were trying to do so that we can understand what the council actually did. And so there's, at the Liturgical Institute or this other institutes, you can take a whole semester's class on the liturgical movement. How great would that be? Oh, but we don't have that much time. So I just want to make 3 points about the liturgical movement at the outset. Here's the first one. The word movement is rightly understood to indicate an endeavor to bring about a change. The false notions in this matter are due principally to a misunderstanding as to the subject of the proposed change. So here's my question to you. What is it that the liturgical movement wanted to move? What is it that they wanted to change? Here's the answer. What is really being striven for is a change in the spiritual orientation of the faithful. The liturgical movement, therefore, as the words indicate, is a movement. It's a movement towards the liturgy. In other words, what the early liturgical movement wished to do was to move us more deeply into the mystery that's being celebrated. So here's my rookie diagram of the liturgy. So there's you on the left side. Here's Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity on the right side. And in the middle is the rite of the Mass, and the signs and the symbols and everything. And this is where we come to meet Jesus. Here's your grandchild. Here's Jesus on the cross. Here's the water being poured and the words being said. That's the ritual. In the early part of the liturgical movement, 1870 to about 1950, they wanted to move us. They were not interested principally in moving or changing rituals. So that's the first point. And it's an important one to have because we're kind of back in that phase now. We're not going to go through a whole lot of other ritual changes. Where the liturgical movement is situated now is with us moving into the heart of the mystery. So that's the first point. A second person you should be aware of is Pope St. Pius X. He's called sometimes the father of the modern liturgical movement. Pius X was elected Pope in 1903, and one of the first letters he wrote was on November 22nd, 1903. Whose feast day is on November 22nd? No? Saint Cecilia. Saint Cecilia. So he writes this letter on sacred music in November 22nd, 1903, where he uses for the first time the term active participation. Okay, maybe some of you have heard that term before. It was coined by Pope St. Pius X. That the more actively the people participate in the divine mysteries, the more grace do we soak up, and then we can go out and change the world, right? He dies, I think Franz Ferdinand was assassinated either right before or right after he passed away. The world was on a brink of war, right? But another thing he says, and so this is kind of a little bit of a counterpoint, or maybe a complementary point to what I said before. Most of the early liturgical movement was about moving us, but there was also an eye to moving some of the rituals. So in 1911, what Pope St. Pius X does is he rearranges the Psalter. So if anybody prays the Liturgy of the Hours, it's 150 psalms, and in 1911 he rearranged the order of these psalms. And really, actually at the time, it met with a lot of resistance, because there's what they call, for example, laudate psalms. It means to praise. And they were always prayed at every morning prayer. Some suggest going all the way back to the time of Jesus, that Jesus prayed Psalm 147, 48, 49, and 50. And Pius X comes along and he rearranges that. Wasn't popular in all quarters. But this is what he says here regarding that change. He says, as the arrangement of the psaltery has a certain intimate connection with all the divine office and the liturgy, it will be clear to everybody that by what we have here decreed, we have taken the first step to the emendation of the Roman breviary and the Roman missal. But for this we shall appoint shortly a special council or commission. So already in 1911, there's a desire to reform, restore the missal and the breviary. Now, times being what they were and work being as it is, he never really got around to it. So a few years later, he writes this. He says, in the judgment of wise and learned persons, all this restoration would require considerable work and time. And for this reason, many years will have to pass before this type of liturgical edifice, composed with intelligent care for the spouse of Christ to express her piety and faith, can appear purified of the imperfections brought by time, newly resplendent with dignity and fitting order. And so this too, I think, is an important point to make, is that already in 1913, there was an eye to reforming the missal, because there were imperfections that needed to be clarified so that the sacred liturgy could convey more clearly the divine things which underlied it. Okay. The third thing, again, there's all sorts of fascinating liturgical movement figures, but a third one here is Romano Gardini. Probably he's the most famous liturgical movement figure. Has anybody heard of Romano Gardini? Okay. He wrote a book that's still published today called Meditations Before Mass. Okay. His cause was opened. Sometimes you see the name Cardinal Marx of Germany. He opened up Gardini's cause about 5 years ago, so he's a servant of God. He sounds Italian, but he's actually German. Okay? And in 1918, he wrote a book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. The Spirit of the Liturgy. And it was so famous, it really put him on the map. And he got this big shot teaching job at the University of Berlin as the chair of philosophy and Catholic worldview in 1923 until 1939, when he was fired. Okay? It escaped in some ways with his life. But very influential on Pope Francis. Pope Francis wrote his doctoral dissertation on Gardini, and also very influential on Pope Benedict XVI, who himself wrote a book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. I think if I ever write another book, I'm going to call it The Spirit of the Liturgy. I mean, why not? But this is what Pope Benedict says about Gardini. One of the first books I read after starting my theological studies at the beginning of 1946 was Romano Gardini's first little book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. This slim volume may rightly be said to have inaugurated the liturgical movement in Germany. Its contribution was decisive. It helped us to rediscover the liturgy in all its beauty, hidden wealth, and time-transcending grandeur, to see it as the animating center of the church, the very center of Christian life, right? Why was this a novel thing? To help us to see again the liturgy as beautiful, wealthy, full of grandeur in the center of the church's life. Because in 1918, people were not seeing the liturgy like that. Okay? He helped the church to rediscover that. Okay? Another of his great concerns was the modern person's liturgical capacity. Okay? What he means by that is the liturgy is essentially a work of art. It's a poem. It's a musical. But most people, and this probably includes us too, it's not a classroom. We're very didactic. We want explanations and things like that. That's not the type of animal that the liturgy is. It deals in symbols and signs and music and texts and things like that. Okay, so here are three things that happened before the Second Vatican Council, all right? A desire to purify the liturgy, a desire to move people into the heart of the liturgy, a refocusing on the liturgy's signs and symbols. This early liturgical movement was very faithful to the Holy See, things like that. Okay, so now we can go to the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. When was the last time you read this document? Anyway, what did it actually say? Well, this fellow is he went to the council, and this is what he wrote about it. He said, "It was no accident that the first completed task or work of the Vatican Council proved to be the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. For decades, a vigorous liturgical movement had been going on. Thus, when the council addressed itself to the liturgy, all the basic spadework had been done." This was not true of all of the documents. Some of you might be familiar with the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, called Gaudium et Spes. That was never even on the docket when the council began. It just sort of emerged from the discussions as the council went along. But that's not the case with this one. There's all of this preparation work going into it. Here's Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, in one of the photographs from the council. He looks like he's ready for a coffee break at this point. But he wrote this at one point. He says, "The liturgy, everybody speaks about it, writes about it, and discusses the subject. It's been commented on, it has been praised, and it has been criticized. But who really knows the principles and norms by which it is to be put into practice?" And this is the question I'm going to ask you very shortly. So those pens, John, can you get some other pens? We're going to have everybody write this stuff down. The Constitution referred to the liturgy as the source and summit of the Church's life. What is being done to make this sublime definition a reality? Okay, so I'm going to ask you, we're going to take a little Vatican Council II Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy quiz. And we'll see how you do. There's 8. I thought this was kind of a good biblical number. There's 8 questions here. You can write these down or not. But if you write them down, don't get them confused with the questions and have them end up in the basket. Here's the first question. What were the 4 stated aims of the Second Vatican Council as written in the opening paragraph of Sacrosanctum Concilium? All right. So probably most of us in this church, in the building, we're sons and daughters of the church and the magisterium, following the documents, and we all have an opinion, surely, about the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy and the Second Vatican Council, but who knows what they were actually trying to do? Does anybody? 4 stated aims. Maybe allow you a little more time? We'll just go to the answer. This sacred council, and that's what the term Sacrosanctum Concilium means, this sacred council. These documents take their Latin titles from the first words of the paragraph, has several aims in view. It desires first to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. Second, to adapt more suitably the needs of our own times, those institutions which are subject to change. Third, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. And fourth, to strengthen whatever can help to call the whole of mankind into the household of the church. And for this reason, we're going to start with the sacred liturgy, because the sacred liturgy is what invigorates Christian life. And the sacred liturgy can, in fact, in certain areas, adapt itself to the needs of different cultures and times and peoples, while, third, at the same time, there's a substantial unity that has to be maintained. Okay? And if we do this, then the viability and the vigor and the life of the church is strengthened to call people into her unity. This is from the opening address of Pope John the 23rd, October 11th, 1962. So John mentioned the council ended on December 8th, 1965. This is the day it opened. John the 23rd's feast day today is October 11th. And in the Office of Readings for John the 23rd, it's this opening speech, or an excerpt of it, from the Second Vatican Council. See, but in those 4 things, there's 2 here that I think are important for us to know. That's adaptability weighed against substantial unity. And this is where the sort of polarity and tension, it's a good tension. It's not one to be won by one side or the other. But this is where the balance is difficult to strike. But this is what he says at the opening of the council. It is necessary, first of all, that the church should never depart from the sacred patrimony of truth received from the fathers. That is, the 21st Ecumenical Council wishes to transmit the doctrine, pure and integral, without any attenuation or distortion. In other words, we're not throwing out 1900 years of our faith or its liturgical expression. Okay? We want to keep that. But at the same time, she must ever look to the present, to the new conditions and new forms of life introduced into the modern world. The substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing, and the way in which it is presented is another. And it is the latter that must be taken into great consideration. So we see this applied in Sacrosanctum Concilium, this balance between substantial unity and local change and adaptation. That sound tradition may be retained, and yet the way remain open to legitimate progress. See, we want both of these things. We want both of these things. We don't want everything new, and it's not a museum piece, the liturgy. Careful investigation is always to be made into each part of the liturgy which is to be revised. But there must be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them, and care must be taken that any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically out of the tradition and from forms already existing. Okay, good. So there's question one. Let's go to number two. The primary actor in a liturgical celebration is the priest, the deacon, the parish liturgist, I like that one, the assembly or other. Who is it? You can play along. This is audience participation time. It's other. It's Jesus. It's Jesus is the primary actor in any liturgical celebration, right? Why did we not all get that? It's so obvious. It's not obvious after a while, right? It's because we can kind of get in the way. Because I want what I want. I don't always want what Jesus wants. I'll be honest with you. I don't. But I always want what I want. Christ is always present in his church. Jesus Christ is the prime minister of the Mass. Father Burrish is his icon, is his sacramental sign. Especially in our liturgical celebrations, he is present in the sacrifice of the Mass, not only in the person of his minister, but especially under the Eucharistic species. He's present in the sacraments, he's present in his word, he's present when the church prays and sings. Rightly, then, the liturgy is considered as an exercise of the priestly office of Jesus Christ. In fancy pants liturgical theology classes, they call this ex opere operato. And what it means is Jesus is the primary actor in everything liturgical, right? So if you're going to go to confession, you don't have to guess should I go to Father Burrish? I'm going to get more forgiven if I go to Father Burrish, or if I go to Father Nowicki. He seems like he's having a bad day. No, what this means is Jesus is the one forgiving. Jesus is the one baptizing. Jesus is the one sacrificing. In more recent history, there's been this problem with an invalid formula for baptism. We baptize you in the name of the... That's invalid because Jesus is the I. Jesus is the one who is the principal actor. And if any of you has been paying attention to what Bishop Battersby has been saying over and over again, sort of his motto, it has been, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about Jesus. Okay? And so this is the second principle and norm that the Constitution puts forward. And all of our reforms are trying to make the person and action of Jesus all the more manifest to the people who are praying. All right, let's go to number 3. We got some multiple choice, we got some short essays, we got some true and false. True or false? The liturgy is symbolic. We got some truths, we got some falses. Probably your answer should be prefaced by, Karstens, you tell me what you mean by symbolic, and then I'll answer your question, right? Because it's a slippery, tricky term, isn't it? Sometimes we'll say, oh, well, that's just symbolic, by which we mean, oh, there's nothing to it. It's just empty. It's a shell. At other times we say, oh, that was a truly symbolic gesture that you made, in which case we mean it's full of meaning. Well, which one is it? Are the sacramental signs and symbols that you Catholics use, are they just mere empty tokens? Or are they filled with meaning? They're filled with meaning. They're filled with, go back to question number 2, they're filled with Jesus, right? So the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy says at this point, in the liturgy, the sanctification of the man is signified by signs perceptible to the senses, and is affected in a way which corresponds with each of these outward signs and symbols. The Catechism will say, in fact, the liturgy is woven from signs and symbols. If you want to put it this way, the liturgy uses supernatural signs and symbols. Okay? But yeah, it's this tapestry of symbolic words and gestures and vestments and buildings and times and places and people and candles and all of the rest that put together, see, this is the etymology of this word. Balein means to hurl, throw, or toss. And in English you hear this as ballistic. So like a ballistic missile. This was in the news a couple of weeks ago from Iran to Israel. Okay? A symboleo is a throwing together into a whole, such that when you see the outward, when you see, smell, taste, touch, or hear the outward part, you have a real, true, substantial encounter with the inward part. So imagine where you are at the moment of consecration. Probably in the same spot you usually sit in, by the way, but that's a different topic. Okay? And Father Burrish is a sacramental sign of Jesus, and the vestment he's wearing is emblematic of the dress that they wear in heaven, and the alb is a restoration to that original innocence, just like a little baby puts on. Okay? And the candles and the altar and the words, all of these things, Jesus is just screaming at us through these sacramental signs and symbols. But again, if you go back to Gardini, most of us don't transact like that. Okay? So this makes it a little bit difficult for us to participate oftentimes in the liturgy. But yes, the liturgy is filled with sacramental signs and symbols. All right. Oh yeah, okay, so let's hit this one then. So what the council wanted to do was to make sure that those sacramental signs and symbols, on the one hand, radiate very clearly Jesus, and on the other hand, be accessible to the people of the 20th century and 21st century. So what they wanted to do, what was the word that Pius X used? I don't know if it's purify or not. They wanted to clarify some of the rites. So for example, the rites are to be simplified with due care taken to preserve their substance. So this came to mind because I know Father Burrish and down at Holy Ghost is working on the church, and the bishop's going to come and he's going to rededicate the church. Well, prior to this, there were 4 different types of holy water. There was lustral water, which is water with salt put in it. There is baptismal water, where there is the holy oils, oil of catechumens and sacred chrism poured into it. There's Epiphany water, which is blessed, as you may have guessed, on Epiphany and used for different things. And then there's Gregorian water, which has wine poured in it and ashes poured in it. And Gregorian water, Father Burrish, you better have some of that on hand if it were 100 years ago, is sprinkled by the bishop outside of the church. This is before the bishop goes in and writes the alphabet in both Greek and Latin in ash on the floor with the bottom of his crozier. Okay? So very cool, but perhaps overly complex, needed to be simplified. Elements with which with the passage of time came to be duplicated or were added with but little advantage are now to be discarded. Okay, this was in the Wall Street Journal just this last week, a little debate between Bishop Paprocki of Springfield, Illinois, and a priest, I don't remember who he was, about the use of the St. Michael prayer after Mass. Right, so there were these Leonine prayers, it included St. Michael and some Hail Marys, can't remember exactly which, that were said especially after low Mass. Okay, well those were considered not necessary, so those went away. Other elements which had suffered injury through accidents of history are now to be restored. So in the extraordinary form, the priest would turn, this is before the Liturgy of the Eucharist began, the priest would turn and say, Oremus, which means, let us pray. And then what would you pray? Nothing. What should have been prayed was the universal prayer, the prayer of the faithful, the general intercessions, but they had been omitted many centuries before. So this third thing, they wanted to restore them. So simplifying, eliminating unnecessary duplications, restoring things to the past, it's all to make the sacramental system more accessible to the people. And this, frankly, this is where liturgical arguments happen, right in this column right here. How well or poorly do these do the trick? Okay. Number 4. In the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, blank is the aim to be considered before all else. Nobody knows? A little term called active participation. Active participation. Now, as I mentioned, this was coined by Pope St. Pius X on November 22nd, 1903. And the Council Fathers, this is maybe more trivia than real meaty stuff here, they voted to approve the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy on November 22nd, 1963. 60 years to the day of Pius X using this term. This feat was overshadowed by other world events on November 22nd, 1963. But this term, this is interesting too. So Pope Benedict would say, interesting is the right word, Pope Benedict would claim that unfortunately this very fundamental principle was quickly misunderstood to mean that as many people as possible, as often as possible, ought to be visibly engaged in some sort of action or ministry. Okay? But that's not what Pope St. Pius X meant by this. Does anybody know these saints? They're patron saints of all sorts of things. Pius X was patron saint of First Holy Communicants and the Eucharist, because what Pius X did was he lowered the age of First Holy Communion to about the age of discretion, which we can quibble about that too. It's age 7. What Pius X meant then by active participation wasn't that I get to be a lector now. The key, or the zenith really, of active participation was the worthy reception of Jesus in the Eucharist. Simon of Cyrene was actively participating in the Paschal mystery of Jesus, was he not? That's what is offered to us when we participate in the Eucharistic prayer and when we receive the Blessed Sacrament worthily, is to join Jesus in his active participation of the cross. And probably so you know this too. If you go to church things like this, right, you're probably in the choir, you probably are a lector, or you probably are an usher, or you're probably, all sorts of things. Isn't it great just to go to Mass once and you don't have to, do anything except pray? Right? You don't have to worry about when am I supposed to go up again, and how do I say that word, and what's that interval that the psalm... You can just go and pray. It's almost easier to actively participate from the nave than it is from the sanctuary. Okay, so that's the aim to be considered before all else is the active participation in the Paschal mystery of Jesus Christ. Being a lector is rather secondary to that most important point. Okay, let's go to, all right, you're halfway through. Is anybody batting 1,000 still? No? Okay. Number 5, the Constitution puts forth the following norm: no other person, even if he be a priest, may add, remove, or change anything in the liturgy on his own authority, near the beginning, near the middle, near the end, in the appendix, or it does not appear in this document. It's the very first norm put forward by the Council Fathers, right? The very first. So paragraphs 1 through 21 are laying out some theological foundations. Okay? And then when it starts to lay down actual principles and norms for the practical reform and restoration of the sacred liturgy, this is the one that it says first. Nobody, not even a priest, may add, remove, or change anything on his own authority. Right? So there can be adaptations, but most of the time this is happening at the level of the universal church or of the diocesan bishop. Now, again, go back to this sacred council has 4 aims in view: to invigorate, to adapt, but to unify, to safeguard the unity of the rite that has been cultivated through the centuries and over the years. And this norm, I'm going to show you some of the, not very briefly, some of the post-conciliar documents. They repeat this ad nauseum. Okay? You can't just start changing things under your own authority. St. Mary's Parish, Father Bob or Bill or whatever. Just random places and names, I'm saying there. Okay? And part of this is because this is the character of the Roman Rite. So maybe some of you either went to or watched the Eucharistic Congress over the summer, and there was the Syro-Malabar Divine Liturgy. Anybody see that? Okay. So in the West, we have an emphasis, at least the Roman tradition, on unity. We have one church, it's called the Latin Church. In the East, there's more of an emphasis on diversity. There are 22, or maybe it's 23, I don't even know, different self-governing churches in the East. Okay? So this is the character of the Latin Church and the Roman Rite that we are a part of. This too can make it difficult living in 2024 America, because all of our formation culturally has been about the Lone Ranger is our guy, isn't it? Okay, and you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Okay, and you do what you want, when you want to do, how you want to do it. That's not kind of the liturgy thing. It's unity. It's about unity and oneness. Okay. Number 6. Which city does Sacrosanctum Concilium recognize as having the model liturgy? No, it's not a trick question. Rome, okay, that's one option. La Crosse, nobody's going to say La Crosse, Chippewa Falls? Okay. Yay, yes, heaven. Okay. In the earthly liturgy, we take part in a foretaste of that heavenly liturgy, which is celebrated in the holy city of Jerusalem, toward which we journey as pilgrims, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God, a minister of the holies of the true tabernacle. We sing a hymn to the Lord's glory with all the warriors of the heavenly army. Venerating the memory of the saints, we hope for some part and fellowship with them. We eagerly await the Savior, our Lord Jesus Christ, until he, our life, shall appear, and we too will appear with him in glory. So this is actually one of the things that the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy emphasizes. I wouldn't say it's new, but it certainly is an emphasis that the Sacred Liturgy doesn't simply look back 2,000 years to the cross and to the Last Supper and to the resurrection. The liturgy also, you might even say even principally looks forward and upwards to heaven. Okay? So like think about your celebration of the Mass. I mean, I presume Father Burrish is walking out not like Jim Caviezel dressed up like Jesus in a toga and he's got the long curly hair and the wigs and things like that. No, he's dressed up like Jesus in heaven. Okay? And he's surrounded by an altar that exists in heaven and flaming torches that you see in heaven. And the ministers wear albs because that's what they're wearing in heaven. Okay? And the chalice that he uses isn't like the one they found in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's gold, it's perfect, it's heavenly, it's perfected. So, you see in this bumper sticker, my boss is a Jewish carpenter? Okay. The Catholic version should say, my boss is Jesus Christ, King of the universe, seated eternally at the right hand of God the Father, reigning in heaven. But it's too long for a bumper sticker. But that's where we are participating with heaven. Maybe this is just nerd trivia, but all of these subsequent documents, this was the first one that Paul VI quoted, this paragraph right here about we want our liturgies to be heavenly. They're not passion plays. They're not reenactments. They're participations in heaven. Okay, only a couple are left. True or false? Liturgical art and architecture are to be characterized by a noble simplicity. Yeah. We got some truths, we got some falses. This is kind of a tricky one. The answer is false. It's false. What it says is, ordinaries, by the encouragement and favor they show to art which is truly sacred, should strive after noble beauty rather than mere sumptuous display. But many people did read this as, it's not supposed to be necessarily beautiful. Beauty is present there. In fact, another part of the Constitution, it says they're signs and symbols of the supernatural world. Okay? Now, this line, noble simplicity, refers not to art and architecture, but to the rituals that we celebrate. The rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. But even this is a little deceiving. I know a handful of Latin phrases, and here's one of them. What this means is, ritus nobilis simplicitate fulgeant is the last word. And if Monsignor Gorman were here, Monsignor Gorman is never around when you need him, is he? Monsignor Gorman were here, he'd tell us what fulgeant meant. It means let them shine, let them radiate. In English, we have a word called refulgent. My dear, you look refulgent tonight. Radiantly beautiful. In Latin, there's a noun, fulgor, fulgoris, and it means a flash. It's the Latin word for a flash of lightning. So you see what this means. The rituals ought to communicate in a flash. Going to Mass ought to be going to Mount Tabor, where the divine beauty of God radiates in a flash to the people through material things. That apparently is what the Second Vatican Council wanted of the Mass, that the rites should communicate in a flash their substance, which is God. And what happens if you get to stand in that radiance? I saw this one recently. It was by Blessed Carlo Acutis. When you stand out before the sun, you get tan. When you stand before the Eucharist, you become saints. So it's just like Moses, when he was face to face with God for 40 days and he came down from the mountain, he has the radiance of God shining off of his face. This is why saints are so beautiful, because they radiate God's beauty and less their own beauty. So if you could stand in Mass and have God radiate his beauty in a flash, that's how it's supposed to work. Okay, and then the last one. Which best describes the Constitution's teaching on the use of Latin in the liturgy? Latin is to be kept in its entirety, abandoned entirely, or used along with the vernacular language. See. Particular law remaining in force, the use of Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites, but since the use of the mother tongue, whether in the Mass, the administration of the sacraments, or other parts of the liturgy, frequently may be of great advantage to the people, the limits of its employment can be extended. And furthermore, this is speaking about the Mass in particular, nevertheless, steps should be taken so that the faithful may be able to say or sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass, the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, which pertain to them. Right? So not only did the Council Fathers not jettison Latin altogether, according to the Second Vatican Council, everyone in this room should be able to sing or say in Latin the Gloria, the Credo, and other things like that. But the language question is certainly a central one, right? We sinned, rather our parents did, we sinned by not listening to what God told us to do. And so how fitting that the Redeemer God would send would be a Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So when the church prays or proclaims the gospel, especially at the Mass, those words have the Word in them. So it matters how you say a thing. Okay, there are many more norms and principles that we could possibly discuss. Here's what I think are 8 key ones, okay, for you to take home. Now, before we get to this last part, today there is still work. This is last year or 2 years ago. So in 2022, there is still work to be done in implementing the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. In particular, by rediscovering the reasons for the decisions taken with regard to the liturgical reform, by overcoming unfounded and superficial readings. And I hope our little exercise so far has helped to kind of go back to the text and have a look. Partial receptions, right? I like this part, and I like that part, and I don't like that part. Okay, this is what we do as human beings. And practices that disfigure it. Okay. Well, the final part, which again is very brief here, what are we supposed to think about all this? Right? So you read the Constitution, people do that. They read it and say, well, this didn't happen, and that didn't happen, or it didn't happen, and did they know it was going to happen that way? What do we make of all of this? And I want to just suggest 3 different perspectives, I suppose, to look at what happened. The first is the sort of official magisterium, the second is cultural, and the third I would classify as ecclesial. Let's look at the first one. And I guess the thing to note first is that the Constitution is speaking in broad and general terms, in norms and principles. Well, now you got to translate that into concrete things about how it's going to look at Notre Dame Church across the street. Okay, so this took a little bit of time. So on January 25th, 1964, so this is 6 weeks later after Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Paul VI establishes the concilium. He says there's certain things you can do now before we get new books. You can give homilies on Sunday. You can start teaching liturgy in the seminary. Okay, there was an hour of the Liturgy of the Hours called Prime that was omitted. You can go ahead and start skipping that now. You don't have to wait for a new set of books. Oh, and by the way, no other person, not even if he be a priest, can add, remove, or change it. Just wanted to throw that out there. The second one is called interecumenici. And this is where you really start to get some concrete changes. So it used to be the celebrant, I think, would have to repeat every one of the texts that, say, the choir would sing. Okay? Psalm 42 and the last gospel and the Leonine prayers were omitted at this point. All could sing. You've been doing this if you're not familiar with going to the extraordinary form and it comes time for the Our Father and the priest introduces it and you're all ready to go, but only the priest says the Our Father in the extraordinary form. Okay, so now this changed. Everybody would say the Our Father together. Different things like that. What's curious about this is where was your bishop in September of 1964? So the Holy See sends out this letter to all the bishops to help them out with implementing the Constitution, but they didn't check their mail because they were in Rome. So the liturgists got to take care of it. Okay, a third one, tres ab hinc annus. Other things, only one opening prayer. So it used to be if you had overlapping feasts or octaves, there would be a number of opening prayers, or there could be more than one at a particular Mass. Okay? They reduced the numbers of kisses and genuflections and crosses. The Eucharistic prayer could be recited aloud at this point. Okay? We're used to the blessing and then the dismissal, go in peace. It had been the opposite. It was go in peace and then the blessing happened. Because imagine, the bishop's walking back to the sacristy and he's blessing people as he goes. Well, they switched this around. It was the blessing and then the dismissal. Fourth, liturgical restoration, I guess is what this would be called. Now at this point, so this is in 1970. In 1969, this is when some of the books start to come out, but maybe Father Schultz can speak to this. The books sort of come out piecemeal and in sections. The order of Mass, the general instructions, and then the prayers would come, and you just get a new sheaf or a new missive gradually. But in number 4, there were warnings about bread that tasted like uncooked flour, and no altering of texts. Okay, so it has a little bit different tone. John Paul II wrote a letter on the 25th anniversary where he's talking about the time of change is over, now it's a time of deepening, and so on and so forth, up to this letter by Pope Francis. But if you really want to get a grip on what happened after the Second Vatican Council, part of your examination, study, and evaluation has to take into account, well, what was the church saying? What was the mind of the church about how to implement this? So this is the first thing. The second thing that I think we should take into account is cultural, especially in the world. In particular in 1968, when a lot of these things were being implemented. John mentioned he wasn't alive in 1968. I wasn't either. But I've often wondered what it would have been like. 2020 came along, and I thought I started to have a good idea what that was like. What happened in 1968? The Tet Offensive began in January in the Vietnam War. Shortly after that, there were student protests and sit-ins. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of 1968. In May 1968, there were student protests and riots. This is in Paris and all around the world. June, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. July, Humane Vitae. August, the Prague uprising, which was squelched by the Warsaw Pact. So they were trying to give a little bit more liberty to their citizens until that was put down. The 1968 convention in Chicago, Mayor Daley shouting at one of the speakers. And there was even, this was news, there was even a flu pandemic, for crying out loud, in 1968. Okay. So COVID, they guess, said, like I looked this up today, 8 million reported deaths. They guess as many as 4 million during this pandemic. So, imagine 2020, and we're just trying to figure out what to do with like the sign of peace and stuff like that, and are we supposed to be singing? Imagine trying to implement a Vatican Council in 2020 or in 1968. It was just not a conducive time to that. And then my final thing that I'll offer is, I guess, would be sort of a mental or ecclesial way of thinking about this. So this is in a book written in the 1980s, Pope Benedict says that the crisis in the liturgy, and hence in the church in which we find ourselves, has very little to do with the change from the old to the new liturgical books. How interesting that the change, in fact, had very little to do with the former missal and the new missal. Well, what was it then? This was his first address. He talks to the Roman Curia every Christmas, these popes do. This was his first address, I guess, in 2005 to the Roman Curia. So this is on the 40th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. Why has the implementation of the Council in large parts of the Church thus far been so difficult? Well, it all depends on the correct interpretation of the Council, or as we would say today, on its proper hermeneutics, the correct key to its interpretation and application. The problems in its implementation arose from the fact that two contrary hermeneutics came face to face and quarreled with each other. One caused confusion, and the other, silently but more and more visibly, bore and is bearing fruit. Okay, so what were these two battling ways of interpreting the Council? Here's the first one. The hermeneutic of discontinuity risks ending in a split between the preconciliar church and the post-conciliar church. We might even say between the preconciliar liturgy and the post-conciliar liturgy. It asserts that the texts of the Council, as such, do not yet express the true spirit of the Council. It claims that they are the results of compromises in which, to reach unanimity, it was found necessary to keep and reaffirm many old things that are really now pointless. The true spirit of the council is not to be found in these compromises, but instead in the impulses towards the new that are contained in the text. So this is one that sort of the church came to a halt in 1963 and got a fresh start moving forward. This is the hermeneutic of discontinuity and disruption. The other is called the hermeneutic of reform in continuity, and this is how he describes it. Here I shall cite only John the 23rd's well-known words which unequivocally express this second hermeneutic of reform or renewal, when he says that the council wishes, and this we've heard this before tonight, wishes to transmit the doctrine pure and integral without any attenuation or distortion. And he continues, our duty is not only to guard this precious treasure, as if we were concerned only with antiquity, but to dedicate ourselves with an earnest will and without fear to that work which in our era demands of us. And this is the last slide. Wherever this latter interpretation guided the implementation of the council, new life developed and new fruit ripened. 40 years after the council, we can show that the positive is far greater and livelier than it appeared to be in the turbulent years around 1968. Today we see that although the good seed develops slowly, it is nonetheless growing. I'd say this is evidence. It is nonetheless growing, and our deep gratitude for the work done by the council is likewise growing. Okay, so that ends the talk tonight. So I wanted us, and I hope you found this fruitful, to go back and actually look at some texts. Don't take anybody's word for it. Go back to the text and see what they say. Peek behind the council to see what was going on as we led up to it, and then consider in very broad terms, well, what has happened over the last 60 years? Thank you.